My name is Jason S. Fong, the host of Vanilla Club podcast. Today's episode is with Keith Tonkin. Following the Air India crash in June, I felt compelled to reach out to an aviation expert to gain some better understanding on this disaster. Keith Tonkin is a former military and commercial pilot and is now managing director of Aviation Projects, an aviation consultancy based in Queensland. Keith takes us through a bit of his background, the childhood inspiration to become a pilot, and the important work he's doing today as an aviation consultant. We also dive into the inner workings of the aviation industry. Flying has become so ingrained in modern life that we seldom recognize the complex, multifaceted exercise it is in supply chain optimization. We even talk about meal service and the just-in-time logistics that go in to getting your meal hot and tasty in flight. Every single flight is essentially a just-in-time factory, of course, with an immense number of moving parts that all have to come together. We touch on the mystery and tragedy of Air India Flight 171. Keith also offers us his advice for young prospective pilots in the field. Please enjoy Vanilla Club Podcast's first attempt at an episode in response to news and world events. If you're new here, don't forget to check out our catalog of other episodes. I can guarantee that there will be something of interest to you in there. Keith Tonkin, thank you so much for coming on the Vanilla Club podcast. It's a real pleasure to have you on the show today. A little bit of background about us. We are a vanilla plantation and micro resort in North Queensland, just south of Cairns. And our whole mantra is not just keep it simple, stupid. It's KISS with 3 S's. Keep it stupidly simple, stupid. So this podcast series is really an attempt for us, in the attempt to try to keep it simple, to venture out into the world and engage with people in the nonprofit sector, in business, in media, who deal with complexity in some form or fashion. So we're here today with Keith Tonkin, Managing Director of Aviation Projects, somebody who is aviation expert, who's both got a civil and military background in many aspects of aviation, running his own consultancy now, doing some really exciting work in the field. So today we wanted to just, I think, have a chance to ask a few generalist lay questions of somebody who is an expert, talking generally about the aviation business to many of us who are sort of part-time av geeks. It's no surprise that, it's a multifaceted business, so many different stakeholders, many complexities that involve lots of different elements, whether that's hedging risks for fuel, whether that is just the complexity of managing global workforces, security, worries about terrorism, and so forth. So we'll have a chance to dig into a few questions of that sort. And maybe we'll also ask Keith to give a little bit of background about how he got excited about aviation in the first place and what his journey was in this sector. So Keith, welcome. Maybe you could give us a little bit of a background about yourself and Aviation Projects.
That's great to be with you. Thanks, Jason. Well, it's been a long journey for me, starting way back when I was about 10 years old, when I was driving a tractor around our little farm in Western Australia and saw a fast military jet fly over at very low level and at very high speed. And I looked up from the seat in my tractor and I thought that'd be amazing to do. And from there, it kind of took step by step through studying hard at school and being selected to join the Australian Defence Force, and then do pilot training and hard work to eventually get to that position of having wings and then flying fast jets. And then from there, I flew with Qantas internationally on jumbo jets, and then domestically on 737s for a little while. And in 2009, I started consulting full-time and have grown the business from there. So that's my journey.
That's fantastic. It's something that, as a consumer of your product, the product, we engage with so many different facets of it just as passengers. Every time I fly, I actually, get a kick out of it, that thrust and takeoff, the whole experience of it. I try to appreciate how many elements are involved in being able to deliver, that product. And there's so many different stakeholders. So maybe, just to kick us off, we could talk a little bit about what it takes to run an airline. When we talk about complexity, the labor force, there's these amazing machines that fly us safely through the air. There is government regulations. There's, we talked about, a little bit about the fuel and all of the variable costs that go into it. There's the airport authorities and so on. Can you just give us a little bit of a snapshot of what it is, what does it take to deliver that product to market?
Yeah, you're right. There's a lot to it. It seems pretty simple. You just need an aeroplane and some pilots and some people to hop on and take off and land. But yeah, like you say, there's the machines themselves are complex, from having an idea of building an aeroplane to designing it and meeting airworthiness requirements to get approved to fly commercially. Is a long task and a complicated task, and it's becoming harder and harder to do that as we improve our systems and expectations about reliability. And from there, whoever owns that aircraft needs to maintain it, and that needs people who know what they're doing. You need the parts on time to be able to repair those aircraft or maintain them. So that relies on logistics chains, which are being disrupted at the moment. And for the systems around the aircraft, that not only includes the airports, but all the people that move transport equipment or cargo or fuel, or replenish the toilets, or put catering on board the aircraft, or move the bag, or do the security screening. There's so many different parts to it. And that's even before you start thinking about having the pilots and the cabin crew trained within duty limits, within numbers of hours limits, available, not sick, and in the right place at the right time, adjusting for disruptions to then take that aeroplane off on a schedule that keeps the network moving. There's a lot of moving parts of that, and that's before we even get the aeroplane off the ground. And then you've got things like, right now we've got Bali affected by volcanic eruptions. We've got the Middle East disrupted by some military activity between Israel and Iran, and all of those things happen with very short notice. And when you've got an aeroplane that can fly for 16 hours, those things can affect the aircraft before or after it takes off. So yeah, there's a lot to it. That's just the operational part of it. Like you say, fuel takes up about 30%, the cost base of an airline, and price of fuel goes up and down at pretty short notice too. So there's a whole world of endeavour around hedging and pricing fuel and getting the right fuel at the right price in the right place when you want it. So yeah, even one of those things needs specialist expertise to make the airline run. Insurances, lease arrangements on the aircraft and the equipment all take special endeavour. And amongst all of that, you're trying to attract and maintain your customer base, which again is fundamental to an airline being profitable. So yeah, lots of moving parts, takes a lot to keep across everything.
A lot. And in addition to that, I mean, most airlines are also finance companies in a way, right? They're selling seats, but they're also in the miles currency business, many of them. And it seems like you've got to run almost, I was looking at during COVID, virtually there was not one airline around the world that wasn't touched by some type of the fact that they were paying for these hedging contracts that now obligated them to buy fuel at a price that was pre-dip in terms of the demand. And they were all on the hook, sometime to the tune, I think Qantas was on the hook for something like $500 million. And then you've got mostly a unionized workforce that you're dealing with. Is that what are the sort of basic dynamics there?
Yeah, you're right. The unions have a pretty long and strong involvement in the aircrew groups, pilots and cabin crew, maintenance engineers as well. And that means that they work hard to have the best quality of life and the best remuneration that they can for their stakeholders. And thinking about that and going back to the rise of Jetstar in Australia, part of the reason for creating a new airline was to reset the cost base of the airline from Qantas to Jetstar so that they could change the industrial relations arrangements. And that meant changing the way that people were promoted, the pay scales that they were being paid. You hear over time various people talk about the different pay scales in the airlines, and you might find some older people who are there for a very long time on very beneficial arrangements, whereas the newer people aren't. And so the airline operators work very hard to lower the costs as best they can, and the unions work hard to keep those pays and benefits for their stakeholders as good as they can. So there's always a tension there.
And all the while trying to get out of the commodity game, right? I would imagine, right? Because to perhaps a Jetstar customer, if you're flying from Sydney to Brisbane, 99.9% of the driver for that purchase is cost, right? Is the price, right? I mean, maybe there's some element of the benefits or things like that, but my sense of it is it's very hard to sometimes break out of the commodity game. Is that your experience?
Some of the airlines have tried very hard to be very specific about that. The Tiger Airways, I don't know if I'd call it an experiment because it was quite successful for what it was, but it eventually came to an end, particularly because of COVID, where they were a very low cost operation and they attempted to be very low, even lower than Jetstar. And Jetstar's model is low cost, so they've always been very proud of that to differentiate that business from Qantas. And so while a seat taking off is perishable, you want to make sure you've got people in the seats paying the right price for you. Once that aeroplane takes off, you don't have that product anymore. So there's a whole bunch of work around getting people in the aeroplane, the right people paying the right price to pay the cost of the airfare and make some profit as well.
And then, in terms of the financing model for the aircraft, my sense of it is that roughly half of the aircraft in the commercial world are leased. Is that roughly correct? So that does that then take the sort of startup cost, for a new entrant into the field? Does it level the playing field to some degree?
I think it lowers the entrance cost for sure for airlines that don't have that capital base to work from. And there are leasing companies that's all they do is they buy airplanes and lease them out. So that's their business. There are some airlines like Alliance here in Queensland that like to own their own aircraft. They've got a different way of approaching that, and for them that works. And some other airlines will do that, but from an operational cost and capital efficiency perspective, having leases is definitely a better approach.
And then the supply of pilots into the workforce. I mean, what are some of the dynamics within the Australian market? My sense of it, I think in the States, there's most of it is civil, but then again, you do have people who retire from the Air Force. I mean, similar to yourself, who end up in the commercial world. You take something like China, it's maybe a flip of that. It's a lot of training is done through the Air Force, and then commercial comes in afterwards. What's the dynamics in Australia?
It's really fragmented. There are lots of big professional training schools that train pilots to a certain standard, and then those pilots will go and find a job somewhere in Australia for some money sometimes, and not much money at all in other times, just to get hours in their logbook. And with those hours, then they can qualify for better jobs. And the smaller airlines are really training grounds for the bigger airlines, and the bigger airlines are training grounds for the biggest airlines. And there's the regular flow of pilots through those different airlines till you get to the likes of Qantas and Virgin, where you're likely to stay. So, yeah, the smaller airlines often suffer from a deficit when the bigger airlines start recruiting and pulling their pilots away, and then they need to go and retrain again. So there's generally an ongoing struggle, but it comes and goes in cycles.
But it is geographically a bit of an unfair advantage that Aussies have, because accruing those logbook hours, I would imagine with the size of the continent, you can rack them up, whereas, talking to a pilot, let's say in Hong Kong, Hong Kong is one airport-ish. I think there's another landing strip, but where do you fly to? Every flight is essentially, you've got to go through a lot more checks, and you need your passport, and you need so on. So is that an advantage for Aussie pilots in the global market for pilots?
I think I've never thought of it like that, but you're right. There are countries the likes of Singapore as well, where they don't have a very big opportunity to go and fly small aeroplanes, doing cattle mustering or sightseeing at Ayers Rock, Uluru, or doing freight runs, or some of the other even pilot training. That's a good way of collecting hours as well. And with aviation is happening all over the place in lots of different ways all around Australia, which is really exciting for the industry. And I think you're probably right that there's an opportunity to collect those hours. Some of them may be very valuable, and some might not be, but they're hours in your logbook, which is definitely a requirement for some of the higher level licenses and approvals. So I think you're right in that regard.
Absolutely. So what about let's take one example about the food. If you're lucky enough to have enough points to get an upgrade for business class, or first class, what is the journey that meal takes to get onto your plate? We're 35,000 feet up in the air. They're serving me a beef Wellington. How is it getting there?
Yeah, sure. So there are catering facilities at the major airports where meals are made to certain requirements, just like any sort of other professional catering facility would, that you would get packaged meals from. And they're very specifically designed to be flavoursome and tasty and nutritional, so that when you are, as you say, 35,000 feet, somewhere between here and somewhere else, they fill your belly and they make you feel good as well. And that's a challenge in itself. They have to meet safety standards for food. They also have to meet security standards. So the meals and the little carts that they're put in are inspected and sealed. They're placed on trucks. Those trucks have to be dealt with via security arrangements before they get to the airport. And then they're loaded onto the aircraft, accounted for, and then the cabin crew will have a plan about what they need to serve when and how they get those meals ready for us through the ovens or otherwise delivered to us. So it's a long process for sure.
So each flight is essentially a just-in-time factory almost. It's an entire exercise of supply chain optimization.
That's exactly right.
And then what are people in the industry worried about in terms of security these days? You mentioned some of the, geopolitical news events that are happening in the world. From an aviation perspective, obviously there's costs that are incurred now that you need to redirect certain ways and you can't use certain airspace, I would imagine. But, since let's say the major rethink, whether that's in the airports or on board, since, let's say, 9/11? What's the sort of current state of affairs in terms of the worries that aviation experts have vis-a-vis security?
It's a really good question. And up until maybe a couple of years ago, the real concern was domestic terrorism. So if we think about Australia specifically, we were concerned with people wanting to harm the aircraft and do something horrible to it in the air. And there were examples of people who had intended to do that who had been stopped. And that was a great success of our security system. But recently, we've been observing people with mental health issues, single people, internally motivated, not exposed to other ideas or cults, I guess, but mostly people who have some sort of personal problem and have a mental disability, or for some reason are feeling personally disaffected with the world and attempting to cause harm to people on airports. And you'll remember that a person attempted to board an aircraft in Aviation only earlier this year with a weapon in a bag, having masqueraded as a maintenance worker. And that person didn't have any external motivations. He was just disaffected for some reason. And another attempt was made to do the same thing at Moorabbin Airport in Melbourne, even more recently than that. And so, yeah, it's more people who are not externally motivated but have a problem with the world of their own. And they're hard to find.
And as you say, it's not their issue is not externally visible. So for ground staff or for security personnel, they can't it's much harder to identify the precursors.
Yeah, that's right. The person at Aviation, he wasn't associated with the aviation industry as far as I understand, and dressed himself to look something like the people you'd expect to see at an airport, and wasn't stopped, unfortunately, when he might have been. But yeah, they're the sort of people we're talking about, people who have a personal issue that they want to resolve somehow, and who are harder to find in the online world and in the actual world.
So, amongst us, they might be our friends or family. It might be, ourselves or viewers of this show. There are a few of us who are afraid to fly. For, I was in New York during 9/11. I can understand the sort of security concern that certain people have, and it ebbs and flows, as we talk about with geopolitical events and things like that. But in terms of the movement or motion in the aircraft, or just a disassociation, being so far from the earth, from what's familiar, what do you have to say to people who are, let's say, hesitant about turbulence or concerned about flying in general?
Yeah, that's a real thing. Yeah, people definitely and validly experience that concern. And I would say that the aeroplanes are designed to sustain really significant changes in the velocity of the air that flies through. So they have really substantial structural integrity. The aircraft are managed and operated to avoid those situations that you would experience that anyway, and the pilots do all the very best to minimise that adverse experience. But from time to time, the aircraft will fly through some of that disrupted air, and that's why we make sure that we have our seatbelts on if we can, and expect that those things will happen. But the aircraft is not going to disappear out of the sky, or the pilots are not going to lose control of that aircraft. They're designed to withstand those types of incident or those atmospheric occurrences.
Because I read a report that there is some concern by scientists that the global warming is exacerbating some of the clear air turbulence. And just anecdotally, I personally don't I don't recall clear air turbulence being as bad as it has been in the last 2-3 years. In flying from Sydney to LA, the last 4 or 5 flights I've been on, they've all had relatively, just not at the point where you're sort of like, but there's a level of clear air turbulence where it's okay, it's uncomfortable. Is there something to this, or these are just anecdotes? What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, you're right. There are some research papers out there that say that the air being warmer and the currents moving around the atmosphere do have a higher intensity in some places. And so I'd say that that's probably, for an empirical data point to say, I think it's more. And there are some researchers that are saying, we've done that analysis and measured it and realised that there is an increasing disturbance in the air. So we can probably expect that to continue.
Okay. And this is something where with more sensors, more diagnostics, more feedback, right? Because in a sense, every single flight that flies before you is just an array of sensors that's feeding back into weather data. It's feeding back into the tools that all of the controllers have. So would it be fair to say that the countermeasure to that is the fact that we're going to have more tools at our disposal?
Maybe not more tools, although there is some work on satellite-based sensors as well. And I know that there's been some reduction in some of the funding for the USA's weather organisation. So there might not be quite as effective forecasting coming out of the USA, but you're right. We have sensors in the form of all of these aeroplanes flying, and we've got a lot of aeroplanes flying just like we had prior to COVID now. So we're back to where we were and increasing again to the point where we should be able to inform people behind us what we experience as we fly through the air. And that's definitely part of the worldwide aviation system, is to have those pilot reports to inform others about it.
What technologies, either immediately on the horizon or sort of, maybe a little bit more projecting forward, excite you? I've heard of some, sort of like assisted takeoff, type of technology, right? Because, again, that's maybe a little bit science fiction, but it is a real problem because so much of the fuel burn occurs in that initial acceleration, right? Just there's so much inertia with that much mass. To have some type of the Navy does it, right, with the catapult on the aircraft carrier. Couldn't we do that for civil aviation?
I don't know catapult specifically. Probably not. There's a whole structural integrity perspective on that. For smaller aircraft, there's work in the electric aircraft, whether you're talking about vertical takeoff or conventional takeoff. There's a view that, as you've mentioned, there's a lot of energy required to get aircraft off the ground, but once they're in the air, we don't need as much energy to do that. And so the aircraft are being designed so that they can have additional and supplementary power, thrust, as it may be, to get those aircraft off the ground, and then it changes to a different propulsion system so that it can optimize the amount of power it needs and when it needs it. So there's a lot of work going on there for sure, particularly with rotor and propeller powered electric aircraft or hydrogen electric. So that's definitely happening and really exciting. Those aircraft are still to come yet, though. We're not seeing them in operational service.
And then we're going to see, different materials come in. Like if you take the 787, all right, I would imagine it's a blend of carbon fiber and some type of alloy. These are lighter weight, higher performing materials. What about the fuels that we're going to see in the future?
Yeah, you're right. The 787 was about 50% composite. So it is lighter than it would be if it was made with traditional materials. And in terms of, and some of the aircraft being designed now, we just don't have the old metal aeroplanes that you rivet together. They're
Right.
much more complicated than that. And some people might say, I'd rather have a metal aeroplane than a composite one, but they're lighter, they're stronger. Sure, they're harder to fix if you get a crack in them, but they're much better environmental footprint. In terms of fuels, it's a whole really massive world of endeavour, because we know that aviation contributes 2.5% to the global carbon output of the world per year. And the industry is working very hard to find solutions to reduce that carbon output. And one of the solutions is the Sustainable Aviation Fuel, SAF. And there are some countries around the world that have a mandate that SAF must be provided and used by airlines. The challenge is producing that fuel and delivering it and having it available where it needs to be in the supply chain. It's definitely one of the highest priorities for the major airline industry.
So we have 8 billion people on Earth, and it seems like the numbers of people who are flying, it goes up. It's not going down anytime soon. There's much more price pressure, to bring those prices down. Presumably, just the flying public is growing, as we speak. So what is the sort of industry view as to accessibility of flying, to the general public? I mean, it's I guess I'm asking this from a standpoint of, flying used to be, 40, 50 years ago, a luxury product. It's now turned into something that is, and you mentioned this with Jetstar, it's a much more accessible product. Where do we go from here?
Worldwide, there's a lot to go. And just thinking about India and China, India, I know, has a very aspirational strategic plan to increase accessibility of aviation services to its population. And that involves not only having more aeroplanes, but more people to fly them and maintain them and operate them, more infrastructure, airports.
Mm-hmm.
They've got to build hundreds of airports to provide those secondary airports to major population centres where other people who aren't currently able to use those services will be able to access them more easily. And that's a massive nation building, capacity building project. It's also happening in China and in other places like Africa where the safety systems are being improved as well. So there's still a long way to go before we see what you probably call a mature aviation system worldwide.
Mm-hmm. Well, you mentioned India, and we also talked about the 787. Obviously, we have to mention the terrible disaster that happened. It seems right now with Air India 171, which miraculously had one survivor. What is? It seems like there's still, it's still very early days. But would you, judging by some of the forums out there, I mean, there's pilots love, it's not speculating, but talking about, the things, the different elements to breaking the chain, right? Isn't that the metaphor that most pilots use about breaking the accident chain? And would you care to offer some comments on what you think some of the factors are, that the investigators might be looking at in this particular case?
Yeah, sure. There's still not a lot of information available, and there has been a lot of armchair analysis for sure. What we know is that the airplane got airborne, so it had enough power to overcome the weight and the drag to get the aircraft off the ground. The wheels weren't retracted where they would normally be retracted, and for some reason the aircraft wasn't able to sustain flight, and we don't know why that is. It could be most likely a loss of thrust, and we don't know why that happened. It's going to be really important to understand that. We don't understand at the moment why the landing gear was left out, because that would be an automatic thing for pilots to do. And it would have been, I think, very distressing being in the cockpit, because there would have been a lot of information being presented to the pilots that they would be trying to process in pretty overwhelming circumstances. I think it'll be sad no matter what is found, because so many people died in that horrific accident, including people on the ground. And it may be very helpful to make sure that we understand how it might be prevented in the future. So we're looking forward to finding out the facts as they come to us.
Yeah, because it's all aircraft, right? Is it fair? I think this is it's a factual statement to say that all aircraft with two engines must be able to. They're designed. It's part of their design specification to be able to take off without one engine, right? I mean, please tell me. But my sense of it is that, like, the 787, its design spec is to be able to take off with one engine. It wouldn't be very comfortable. It would be a very uncomfortable experience. But there's enough thrust in the one engine to be able to complete takeoff in the case you had an engine fire or something like that.
Yeah, once you get to a certain speed on the runway with both engines operating, so that you need to start with both engines running, and then subject to whatever the problem is, if you're at the right speed and one engine stops, you should be able to continue the takeoff on one engine. That we commonly practice that as one of the emergency procedure checks when we're doing our currency training in the simulator, to make sure we can manage that sort of situation. So you would have expected, if it was one engine still operating on full thrust, then it should have been able to take the airplane off the ground and land back safely.
Is like fuel contamination, could that be a factor in something like this?
It's certainly, it's a possibility, probably quite a low one. If you remember, it's quite a long time ago now, but I think it was a 777 that landed short, landing in Dubai after the fuel stopped flowing to the engines. And that was because the fuel got really, really cold and stopped flowing through the pipes that feed the engine. So lots of different funny things happen. I don't know that would be the case when it was quite hot, as it was in Ahmedabad the other day, but there are different circumstances that somehow arrive at a terrible situation like this.
Would you care to comment on the different mindset, perhaps, between civil pilots and, Air Force trained pilots? Is there a difference?
I think military pilots are probably benefit from much more sophisticated training and systems. So I'd say that, having done both, but my flying training was in the military. So I had the privilege of flying well-maintained, sophisticated aircraft with lots of good supervision and highly trained and experienced people around me. And in the general aviation community, aviation systems and procedures and some of the training might not be as rigorous, and you're left on your own a lot. So I think a lot of the lessons that people learn in the general aviation civilian flying community probably won't necessarily be as well structured and designed, but equally beneficial to a pilot who wants to go and have a successful career flying in the airlines.
Yeah, because I know there was a lot of, like, with was it the Asiana disaster? There was I think that would have been, I forget when that was, but there was a lot of speculation that I'd read about some of the communication between the pilot and the co-pilot, and again, it's speculation, but if there was difficulty for the pilot to absorb information that was coming from his junior and coming from an Air Force background, if I don't know, that might be a factor in some cases.
Look, it might be, but we've all got different personalities and styles. And there are different cultural sensitivities, I suppose, or ways that different cultures operate. that might not necessarily be as beneficial as they could be in a cockpit.
Are there safer places to sit on the aircraft than others?
Yeah, I know there's a lot of speculation about that, and I say generally you'd probably prefer to sit near an exit row so that if you need to get out, you can, regardless of whatever the circumstances were. And other than that, I probably wouldn't want to offer any advice that people might take on so that they didn't come back to talk to me about it afterwards.
Right, that's right. Well, first class, you're right in you're in the nose there. But
yeah, I think for me, I'd probably rather be up the front with the controls in my hands. But other than that, yeah, somewhere up the front near the exits is probably a good spot.
So what was your favorite aircraft to fly? Was it the Aardvark?
Yeah, I couldn't go past that. Supersonic bomber was a pretty spectacular aircraft and really good fun to fly.
So tell us a little bit about aviation projects and the work that you do with your consultancy.
Yeah, sure. So we come from an aviation background from my perspective, which it grew out of doing risk management and safety management work and evolved into providing advice to the airports industry. So we do planning, development and operations for airports. That's master planning. It's trying to understand problems with compliance and writing safety cases to get exemptions from requirements, helping develop and operate and manage them. We operate a small aerodrome here in Brisbane called Redcliffe on behalf of the City of Moreton Bay. The other half at the moment of our business is aviation safeguarding, and that's to support people who want to develop something that might have an impact on aviation safety. And those developers might want to put a building up or a crane or a tower or some other structure that might affect where aircraft want to fly. We also do a lot of work in the renewable energy industry with wind farms and solar farms. Wind farms, because of the vertical extent, can affect aviation, as can solar with their glare. And that business takes us all around Australia. And we're just in the process of setting up an organisation that needs approval from the Civil Aviation Safety Authority here to do design of airspace and instrument flight procedures. That audit's actually next week. So we're in the final quarter mile of that process, where if we could get approval, then we'll be able to go and design that airspace. So we support aviation in lots of different ways with safety at our heart.
That's great. And it's, I think that's the dream, to be able to work in an industry that, you have you can tell the effusiveness of your personal passion for aviation, to be able to combine that, into the consultancy work. I mean, that's great.
Yeah, thank you. We also have something that we've only just really started. A couple of my team are now involved with a program in the Pacific called the Australian Pacific Partnerships for Aviation, which has higher level objectives of improving safety and sustainability and economic development opportunities for our Pacific partners. And so I have been spending quite a lot of time in Vanuatu. We're also supporting the little country of Tuvalu, and others are in the Pacific through that program. That's really, really challenging, but very rewarding.
So tell us a little bit about that program. What are some of the main goals or aims of the program?
It's to support the governments that we partner with. And we're talking about Tonga, Samoa, Fiji, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, and others, Nauru. I've probably forgotten some, but all the way through the Marshall Islands, Kiribati. We support all of those governments to improve their aviation system, because aviation is just so important. If you think about Vanuatu, where there's 83 islands and people that aren't able to easily move about and have services delivered to them, aviation is vital. And it's a challenge for smaller countries to set up the regulatory framework, meet at their international obligations, supervise and oversee and surveil all of those operations and make sure that everyone's doing the right thing, but also enabling the economic benefit that comes from aviation. So we act as advisors to those governments to support different parts of the program to assist them achieve those outcomes.
No, that's great. It's great work, and it's through these public partnerships that it's diplomacy in many ways too, right? So no, there's great work there. And then, so what are your thoughts about private aviation? Is that do you brush up on that subsector? Where is private aviation in Australia? Are we seeing? I mean, there's so many. I guess you'd say, what would you call them? Hobby pilots, leisure pilots. Where does that sit, and is that a growth industry that people talk about?
Yeah, that's actually, it's a bit more complicated than you might think. There's been a lot of growth in the I guess the recreational end of aviation. So if we call it recreational, some of the constraints to people being able to fly, which generally around cost and accessibility of airports, but also medicals, because the medical, you have to have a medical to fly. And so there have been some improvements in the accessibility of that recreational aviation through changes to the licensing for medicals, and also the amount of training and time flying the aeroplane that you need just to fly yourself or one other person as a recreational pilot means that more people can access aviation. The challenge is that it's a very low cost operation, and people don't have a lot of margin to be able to afford to fly from some of the bigger or more sophisticated airports with air traffic control services and some of those other industry improvements. And so we find that they're finding it hard to find places to go and do that, because the major airport, the larger airports, a lot of the council-owned airports are levying fees and charges, and those costs become prohibitive for the recreational pilot. So there's a tension between the want and the will and the affordability versus the cost that the aerodrome operators need to recover to provide the facilities for those people to go flying.
But again, there's so there's some natural constraints on the sort of growth, but it is pretty remarkable to see people flying. The civil aviation sector is strong in this country, and it's. In the States, they have some of these, I think there's a couple private communities that are like fly-in type of neighborhoods. You buy a block of land, and instead of having a golf course, you have an airstrip. So, the idea is out there, whether or not, as you said, there's the medical constraints, the health constraint, obviously the cost and things like that. But there's something to be said about the joy of flying.
You're right. There are some of those, they call them air parks. So there are quite a few of those around the country. And I've seen quite a few of them, and some of them are done really successfully. If you go to places like Temora in New South Wales, there are a few of them in Queensland at the Whitsundays. Up near Prospective, there's one. Some are being developed at the moment in southeast Queensland. So there are those types of developments where people can live their dream of having a house, and rather than having a garage for their car, they can put their aircraft in it and then taxi directly onto the runway. So for some people that's nirvana, and there are certainly some of those around the place.
Yeah. Okay. So Keith, so just as a sort of last question, to maybe a young person, watching this, who's interested in flying, who has a dream of becoming a pilot, what do you say to them in terms of their studies, in terms of internships, in terms of pathways to getting into the industry?
Yeah, well, there are there are lots of different ways of doing it. I guess that's the real great news. Whether you graduate from year 12 with 100% on all your exams, or if you're like me, you struggled a little bit, or you didn't have the money. So I would never have been a pilot if I didn't go to the Air Force. We just didn't have the money available to do that. So I was just genuinely lucky, I think, to pass all of the selection process when others didn't. But I meet lots of people who, for some reason, weren't able to enter, but they still became a pilot through one of the different pathways, whether it's going to university now and then studying through the university program, or self-funding, or going and volunteering and getting the odd flying hour here and there until it all suddenly accrues to something much more meaningful. There are lots of different ways of doing it.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Well, Keith, really, it's a pleasure to make your acquaintance. It's a really wide-ranging discussion, and it's great to not only speak to somebody with expertise, but somebody who genuinely, effusively has a passion for what they do. So thank you. And again, if you're in Cairns, come stop by the plantation and micro resort.
Thanks very much, Jason. I might take you up on that.
Great. All right. Have a great day. Take care.
Bye.